Dragon Shield just came out with their new dual sleeves, which are just like their other sleeves, except they have a black background instead of a white background when you put your cards in there. So they're super slick looking, and they have a clear glossy front, so it shows off all your foils really well. Check them out on dragonshield.com. Use my affiliate link down below. It helps support the channel. Hey guys, welcome to BudgetEDH. I'm your host Mike, and on this week's episode we bring you Prosper Tome Bound out of Adventures in the Forgotten Realms, the new Dungeons & Dragons set. Prosper is 2, a black and a red for a legendary creature, Tiefling Warlock. It has Death Touch. It also has Mystic Arcanum. At the beginning of your end step, exile the top card of your library. Until end of turn, you may play that card. It also has Pact Boon. Whenever you play a card from Exile, create a treasure token. So Prosper is all about playing cards from Exile. It's got a really powerful ability, not only that lets you exile cards at the end of your turn, then you can play them on your next turn, but even more importantly is when you do play those cards from Exile, or any card from Exile, even your opponent's, he's gonna make a treasure token that you can use, which is really, really powerful. So you'll see in this deck, we've got a lot of ways of playing cards from Exile in here. We've also got a lot of ways of making treasure and taking advantage of those treasure tokens as well, in addition to sacrifice payoffs. So when we sacrifice those treasure tokens, we're going to get some additional value out of them in addition to just ramping. So we've got ways of draining our opponents when we sacrifice tokens. We've got ways of using those tokens for other things as well. We'll go over some of the win cons in this deck. We've got quite a few in here that makes this deck really powerful. I'm actually super excited. I built this deck myself with some of the upgrades that I'll go over later in the video as well in my personal version of this deck. Let's quickly go over the stats of this Prosper deck. This deck has 10 ramp spells. Now I did put an asterisk next to it. Prosper does make a lot of treasure tokens, so I didn't include that in the ramp. There's a lot of ways that we can ramp with Prosper, because whenever we play a card from Exile, it's going to give us a treasure token, which technically does ramp us, but didn't include that in the total. We've got 6 ways of drawing cards. Again, the asterisk is there because I didn't include the Exile cards, which I'm going to go over here in a second. We've got 8 pieces of interaction. We've got 33 ways of exiling either your cards or your opponent's cards, and then being able to play those to get that treasure off of Prosper. And then we've got 12 exile payoff cards that we'll go over later in the video as well that are going to work really well with Prosper and exiling our cards. And then we've got 35 lands in this deck. Let's get into the deck tech. So first up, we're going to go over all the Exile cards that we've got in this deck, and we have a ton in here to go over. So first up, we've got Conspiracy Theorist. It's a creature. Whenever it attacks, you can pay 1, discard a card. If you do, you get to draw a card. So that's a nice way of looting some dead draws out of your hand as well. And then it's got whenever you discard a card, you may exile one of them from your graveyard. If you do, you may cast it this turn as well. Next up, we've got Dream Devourer. This makes non-land cards in your hand have Foretell equal to the casting cost reduced by 2. Foretell is another way of playing cards from Exile. Dream Devourer is a really great addition to this deck. Next up, we've got Dead Man's Chest. You get to enchant a creature an opponent controls, and when it dies, you're going to exile cards equal to its power from the top of its owner's library, and you can cast any number of non-land cards from among them as long as they remain exiled, and you can spend mana as though it were mana of any type to cast those spells. So this is really nice. We've got a bunch of removal in here as well, so you can play this on your opponent's big creature and then kill it, and then you'll have access to all those cards for as long as they remain exiled, which is really good. Then we've got Direfleet Daredevil. It's a human pirate. When it enters the battlefield, you can exile an instant or sorcery card from an opponent's graveyard, and you may cast that card this turn and spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast it. Theater of Horrors. At the beginning of your upkeep, exile the top card of your library. During your turn, if an opponent lost life this turn, you may play cards exiled with Theater of Horrors. It also has the ability to actually ping your opponents as well, so you can actually turn it on, which is really nice too. Valky God Exploration. It's got landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under control, you're going to exile the top card of your library. You may play it for as long as it remains exiled. It's got some more non-important text on there I'm not really going to go over as well. Then we've got Light Up the Stage. It's got Spectacle. You can pay the Spectacle cost if an opponent lost life this turn, and you can exile the top 2 cards of your library until the end of your next turn. You may play those cards. We've also got Galvanic Relay, which is a newer one out of Modern Horizons. Exile the top card of your library. During your next turn, you may play that card. It also has Storm, which can be relevant in certain cases because you have all those treasure tokens that you're making. You can actually get a couple of copies off of Galvanic Relay, have a big turn where you have played a bunch of spells before this. Poison the Cup is a removal spell that has Foretell, so you can play it from exile as well. Then we've got Bray's Apprentice. When it enters the battlefield, you get to create a 1/1 Thopter. Second artifact, choose one, exile the top card of your library. Until the end of your next turn, you may play that card. This is nice because it gives you some additional value off of those treasure tokens as well. So you can cash those treasure tokens in to be able to exile again and then get another treasure token. So that's kind of nice too. Bone Crusher Giant is in here most specifically for the Stomp spell, because when you cast Stomp, you're going to exile Bone Crusher Giant. Then you can play Bone Crusher Giant from exile, so you get that trigger. And same thing with Murderous Rider 2, lets you destroy a creature. Also, you get to play it from exile. Chaos Wand, this is one of my favorite cards, actually. It's a artifact that you can pay 4 and tap it. Target opponent exiles cards from the top of their library until they exile an instant or sorcery card. You may cast that card without paying its mana cost. Then they put all the cards that weren't exiled in the bottom of their library in a random order. It's actually a pretty powerful card in my experience. Cunning Rhetoric is a newer one. It's an enchantment. Whenever an opponent attacks you and or one or more planeswalkers you control, exile the top card of that player's library. You may play that card for as long as it remains exiled, and of course you can spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast it. This is a nice card. It disincentivizes your opponents for attacking you, and if they do, you get to exile cards and then use Prosper's ability with that to get some more treasures as well. Oracle's Vault is an artifact. You can pay 2 and exile top card of your library. Until the end of your turn, you may play that card. You put a brick counter on it, and then it also has tap, exile top card of your library. Until end of turn, you may play that card without paying its mana cost. You just have to have 3 brick counters on it in order to activate that ability. Then we've got Birgi, God of Storytelling, which both sides are great in this deck. The Birgi side, whenever you cast a spell, add a red to your mana pool. Until end of turn, you don't lose this mana as steps and phases end. And then Harnfell, Horn of Bounty, discard a card to exile the top 2 cards of your library. You may play those cards this turn. Harnfell is really nice in this deck. You can get rid of some lands if flooding out, exile top 2 cards of your library, play them. So if you get a land out of there, you can actually play it off of the horn and then get those treasures as well. Next up, we've got Outpost Siege. You're going to play this on cons almost always. At the beginning of your upkeep, exile the top card of your library. Until end of turn, you may play that card. Wild Magic Sorcerer is in this commander deck. The first spell you cast from exile each turn has Cascade. Hurl Through Hell, also in this deck, is a 4-mana instant that exiles a creature. Until the end of your next turn, you may cast that card, and you may spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast that spell. Another way of casting from exile. Gonti, Lord of Luxury, is another really great card. It has, when it enters the battlefield, look at the top 4 cards of target opponent's library, exile one of them face down, and then you can play that card as long as it remains exiled and use mana as though it were mana of any color to cast it. Ignite the Future exiles the top 3 cards of your library. Until the end of your next turn, you may play those cards, and it also has Flashback as well. And if you do the flashback side, which costs 8 mana, you can actually pay it without paying their mana cost, which is nice as well. Ubermast, this one's gone up quite a bit because of Prosper. It's a 4-mana artifact. If a player would draw a card, that player removes that card from the game face up instead. Each player may play cards he or she removed from the game with Ubermast this turn. So this is going to turn every single card that you draw into basically an exile that you can then play to get those treasures off of Prosper. This is one of the best cards in this deck. Then we've got Fiend of Shadows. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, that player exiles a card from his or her hand. You may play that card for as long as it remains exiled. This also has evasion with flying as well, so this can get in for damage quite easily. Author of Shadows. When it enters the battlefield, exile all cards from all opponents' graveyards. Choose a non-land card, exile this way. You may cast that card for as long as it remains exiled. You may spend mana, of course, as though it were mana of any color to cast. Creative Technique, it's got Demonstrate, which when you cast it, you may copy it. If you do, an opponent also can copy it as well. You get to choose which opponent it is. Shuffle your library, then reveal cards from the top of it until you reveal a non-land card. Exile that card and put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. You may cast it without paying its mana cost. Then we've got Itali, Primal Storm. When it attacks, exile top card of each player's library. You may cast any number of those spells from among them without paying their mana cost. Super, super powerful. It's a powerful commander as well. Hedonist Trove is a 7-mana enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, exile all cards from target opponent's graveyard. You may play land cards exiled with it, and you may cast non-land cards exiled with Hedonist Trove. You can't cast more than 1 spell this way each turn. Super important here to note, you can't spend mana as though or mana of any color, so make sure that if you exile somebody that it's a black and red player, or this is also good if you've got somebody that's playing a graveyard type strategy that's about to go off and do some crazy stuff, you can just exile their graveyard incidentally as well. Fevered Suspicion is a new one out of here as well. Each opponent exiles cards from the top of their library until they exile a non-land card. You may cast any number of spells from among those non-land cards without paying their mana cost. Also has Rebound, so this will also be played from exile on the following upkeep. And last but not least, we've got Commune with Lava. It's an instant. Exile the top X cards of your library until the end of your next turn. You may play those spells. This is a powerful card because it is an instant as well, so you can play it in your opponent's end step, and then you'll be able to play all those cards your next turn as well, which is nice. Next up, let's go over some of the cards that provide us some utility in this deck. So first up, we've got Profane Tutor. It's a sorcery with Suspend for 1 and a black. Search your library for a card, put that card into your hand, then shuffle. Nice thing about this, you'll be able to find some of the best cards in your deck. I'd recommend trying to find Ubermast if you don't have it already, because that card is just sick in this deck. And this also will cast from exile off of Suspend 2, which is really nice. Next up, we've got Colleen, Reclusive Painter. It's a legendary creature. When it enters the battlefield, create a treasure token. Other creatures you control enter the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter on them for each mana from a treasure spent to cast on them. You're going to have a ton of treasure in this deck, so this is easily going to pump up your creatures quite a bit to be able to get some combat damage in on your opponents. Since we are playing a drain type strategy, it will be nice to get some damage in on your opponents through combat as well, so you can close the gap quicker. Next up, we've got Quicksmith Genius. Whenever an artifact enters the battlefield under your control, like a treasure token, you may discard a card. If you do, draw a card. This is a nice way of filtering your draws, getting rid of some lands that you don't need, etc. Then we've got Academy Manufacturer, which is a new one out of Modern Horizons. I love this card. I had it in the Lonas deck that I just built. And if you would create a clue, food, or treasure token, instead you create one of each, which is awesome because then you turn your treasures into 3 different tokens, and we have a ton of ways of dealing damage to our opponents when our artifacts go to our graveyard, when our tokens go to the graveyard, etc., etc. This gets you a lot of value in this deck. Then we've got Grim Hireling. It's a new one. It's a creature. Whenever one or more creatures you control deal combat damage to a player, create 2 treasure tokens. Not super relevant, but I do like this next part. Pay a black and sacrifice X treasures. Target creature gets -X and -X until end of turn. Activate only as a sorcery. This is a nice way of getting some additional value out of your treasure tokens that's not just ramp, and it can remove some problematic creatures that your opponents have on the board as well. Next up, we've got Stormkiln Artist. It gets +1/+0 for each artifact you control. Not super relevant. We don't really care about that, but it also has Magecraft. Whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, create a treasure token. We have around 20 instant or sorcery spells in here, so this will generate you quite a bit of value as well. And then last but not least, we also have Oblivion Sewer in here. When you cast it, target opponent exiles the top 4 cards of his or her library. Then you may put any number of land cards that player owns from exiled onto the battlefield under your control. So this is important to note that this will actually not trigger Prosper because you're putting the land cards that they own from exile onto the battlefield. So you're not playing or casting them. But if you've exiled a bunch of your opponent's stuff over the course of the game, this is going to get you a lot of lands. So you don't really care about the treasures if you're able to put 4, 5, 6, 10 lands into play off your opponents. And you can do that with this card. It's extremely good, so definitely recommend putting it in your deck if you don't have it in there already. So next up, we're going to talk about a couple of the ways that we're going to be able to win the game with this deck. Now, we're going to be able to make a ton of treasures, we're going to be able to ramp, we're going to be able to play big crazy stuff, but how do we win the game with that? One way that we're able to do that is when we sacrifice those treasures, we're able to drain our opponents, almost like a token aristocrat type of strategy. So we've leaned into that heavily into one of the wincons. So the first couple of cards we talk about are based on that strategy. So we've got Disciple of the Vault. When artifacts put into the graveyard from the battlefield, you may have target opponent lose 1 life. One thing to note here is this works off of any artifact getting put into the graveyard, even your opponents too. So this will trigger off of that. So if your opponents play a Dockside Extortionist, sack a bunch of treasures, or they have a Smothering Tide, sack a bunch of treasures, etc., you're going to get some value off of that as well. You can point it at that opponent. Then we've got Reckless Fireweaver. Whenever an artifact enters the battlefield, it deals 1 damage to each opponent. So that's nice. It deals it to all opponents, which makes it really nice, a very symmetrical effect. Mayhem Devil is really, really good in this deck. Whenever a player sacrifices a permanent, any player, not just you, it deals 1 damage to any target. So you can actually target your opponent's mana dorks, their important creatures that they have, etc. with this and actually kill them, which is really good. Then we've got Nadir's Nightblade. Whenever a token you control leaves the battlefield, each opponent loses 1 life, and you actually gain a life, which is really nice too. And then the most powerful one of all is Marionette Master. It's a creature with Fabricate, so when it enters the battlefield, you can put 3 +1/+1 counters or put 3 servos. You're never going to put servos on it, so always put the counters on this guy. Whenever an artifact you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, target opponent loses life equal to Marionette Master's power. Super, super powerful. The only thing here, make sure it does say target opponent, so it's not all opponents at once, so you will have to target one of your opponents with this. The next win con is also treasure related. It is Revel in Riches, which has also gone way up in price. Whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, create a colorless treasure artifact token, which is really nice if we have quite a bit of ways of dealing with creatures in here, and whenever your opponent's creature dies through combat or any single reason, you're going to get a treasure, which is awesome. And at the beginning of your upkeep, if you control 10 or more treasures, you win the game. You will own 10 or more treasures at some point in the game when you're playing Prosper. It's very easy to do. If you have this card, your opponents have to remove it or you're just going to win. And then last but not least, the last win con that we have in here is Exsanguinate. So if you have a ton of treasures and you want to cash them all in, you can have each opponent lose X life. You gain life equal to the life lost this way. So you can drain all your opponents out with Exsanguinate if you need to get those last points of damage in on your opponents. Next up, I'm going to go over some of the upgrades that I made to my own personal deck. I'll put the deck list down in the description below. I'm not going to tell you which cards to take out for your deck, but these cards are really good to put in. So take a look at some of those cards that don't have as big of an impact as some of the cards you're adding, or maybe fill the same role, and you can take one out that's less powerful and add one that's more powerful in. But if you need any suggestions, take a look at my deck list down below. It's my personal deck that I built that I've really been having a lot of fun with so far. So first up is a super expensive one, definitely not budget. It's Dockside Extortionist. I'm still shocked with how much this card cost. It's $65, which is insane. It's a creature that when it enters the battlefield, create X treasure tokens, where X is the number of artifacts and enchantments your opponents control. Most of the time when I cast this card, I make like somewhere around 10 plus treasures because there's so many mana rocks on the battlefield, etc. If your opponent's playing an artifact token deck or an artifact deck like Urza, you're going to make way more. But this card's awesome in here. It's exactly what you want. You want ways of making a ton of treasures because we have so many ways of using those treasures for advantage in here. Next up, we've got another one that has gone up since Prosper came out. It's Stolen Strategy. It's an enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, exile the top card of each opponent's library. Until end of turn, you may cast non-land cards from among those exiled cards, and you may spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast those spells. This is going to let you exile 3 cards. You'll be able to cast them until end of turn, which is awesome. This card was pretty cheap before Prosper came out, so you may have one lying around. If you do, throw it in this deck. It's great in here. Then we've got Opposition Agent. Might get some flack for this because a lot of people don't like when you play this against them, but it's a good card in this deck for sure. It's a creature that has flash. You control your opponents while they're searching their libraries. While an opponent is searching their library, they exile each card they find. You may play those cards for as long as they remain exiled, and you may spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast them. So this is great because it's going to give you additional ways to exile your opponent's cards. It also stops your opponents from tutoring as well, so you'll be able to tutor and get whatever card you want to use off of it, which is awesome. It does get a lot of flack because it is very powerful and people don't like seeing it. Next up, we've got another expensive one out of Commander Legends. We've got Jessica's Will. It's a sorcery. Choose one. If you control a commander, as you cast this spell, you may choose both. Add red each card in target opponent's hand and exile the top 3 cards of your library. You may play them this turn. This card's awesome. It ramps you and also gets you 3 cards to exile, which is basically like drawing 3 cards that you can also play. And if you play them, you're going to get additional ramp off of it, which is awesome. And it gives you the mana to play those cards on this card, which is awesome. So it's just a really, really, really great card. And last but not least, I got a pet card of mine. I really like this card. I've been searching for a place to play it since it came out. It's Valky God of Lies. It's a legendary creature It has two sides, a dual-faced card. You're going to want to play this for the Tibalt Cosmic Imposter side, but I did put the other side there. I'm not going to really talk about it. But Tibalt Cosmic Imposter is a 7-mana planeswalker. When it enters the battlefield, you get an emblem with, you may play cards Exile with Tibalt Cosmic Imposter, and you may spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast those spells. The +2 is exile the top card of each player's library. The -3 is exile target artifact or creature. And -8, exile all cards from all graveyards, add 3 to your mana pool. So most of the time you're going to +2 this, but if there's a powerful creature or something on the battlefield, you can actually exile it or an artifact, and then you can actually play whatever you exiled with Tibalt, which is awesome. So you're going to get rid of their best creature, and then you get to play from exile, get a treasure token, and put their best creature on the battlefield under your control. Really great card. It saw a lot of play in Modern. It doesn't really see a whole lot of play in Commander, but I do really like it in this deck. Thank you so much for watching our video today. If you like this video and you want to see more budget Commander content, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. And you can also check us out on patreon.com/budgetedh. There's a bunch of different tiers and ways to interact with us outside of YouTube. We'll see you guys next time.